Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. Now, on this episode, we're looking at the Kremlin's latest legal weapon, and it's pointed not at extremists, not real ones, not at militants, but at dissidents based in New York. The Russian Supreme Court has officially designated the Anti-Corruption Foundation's US arm, the ACF, as a terrorist organization. This is not by accident. This is persecution by design. In one move, Moscow has elevated a non-profit founded by Alexei Navalny, a man the Russian state persecuted and ultimately allowed to die in a remote prison, to the same legal category as ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And with that single ruling, the Kremlin has unlocked a new legal toolbox for hunting dissidents abroad. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
The trials for Alexei Navalny's organization are far from over. Russian authorities are continuing their crackdown on deceased oppositionists' legacy. Navalny's Anti-Corruption Foundation has been officially labeled a terrorist organization by Russia's Supreme Court. This decision was passed by the same judge who often shares the court's decisions about labeling organizations as extremist or terrorist.
The court has ruled to recognize the international LGBT public movement and its structural subdivisions as extremist and to ban their activities on the territory of the Russian Federation.
Navalny's organization was responsible for uncovering the deep underlying corruption in Russia. Their actions affected the highest echelons of Russian power, including officials like Dmitry Medvedev and Vladimir Putin himself. Since Navalny's death, Russian authorities have been cracking down on anyone with even the smallest connection to the oppositionist or his organization. His allies and supporters have either been forced to flee the country, hide, or have found themselves in jail. To many in Russia and in the West, Navalny had been a symbol that Russia can be something different than what Putin wants. He is also, alas, a symbol of what happens when one tries to reach for their own vision of Russia too much.
And now we're zoning in on the explaining portion of our show. Despite the death of its founder and leader, Alexei Navalny, his Anti-Corruption Foundation has not ceased operations. In the face of rising pressure from the Kremlin and a crackdown by Russian authorities, the organization's staff have been fighting tooth and nail to preserve Navalny's legacy.
Even prior to his death in February 2024, Navalny had re-established his foundation, the ACF, under the name ACF International abroad, to allow it to continue operating no matter what legal status the Kremlin would give it. The organization's leadership was passed down to Navalny's wife, Yulia Navalnaya, who continues her late husband's work to draw attention to the systemic corruption and authoritarianism in Russia. She is also the foundation's public face, as she often accepts awards on Navalny's behalf and leads various remembrance services dedicated to her husband. Nonetheless, the organization's investigative power in Russia has severely dwindled in the wake of Navalny's death. Russian authorities have been arresting journalists, lawyers and activists linked to Navalny, and the country's opposition is fragmented. The ACF cannot operate effectively from abroad, and it is banned in Russia, so it has very limited access to its resources in the country. Its momentum has also crashed, as supporters are concerned for their well-being, and the loss of Navalny's leadership has led to a collapse in popular support.
And now, as always, I invite you to explore the issue in greater detail. For a decade, the Kremlin has steadily reclassified dissent as national security threat. First, foreign agents, then extremists, then undesirable organizations, and now, for those most politically inconvenient, the literal nuclear option, namely terrorists. The Supreme Court's ruling makes clear what the system has been building toward, a domestic legal architecture that treats opposition work the way most countries treat violent jihadists. The case itself was irregular from the start. Terrorism cases, you see, are normally heard by military district courts. The Supreme Court stepping in as a court of first instance is unusual and only happens when the Kremlin wants a symbolic, unappealable outcome. And that's exactly what it got. Behind closed doors, without public evidence, without the defense even allowed to read the prosecutor's complaint, the court rubber-stamped the designation. Transparency was never part of the plan. Intimidation, on the other hand, was. This ruling is not only about theatrics or making a statement, it has real and dangerous consequences. The moment the terrorist label is affixed, Russia's security services gain an entirely new set of tools. Investigations shift from the investigative committee to the FSB. You've heard about them, right? The threshold for prosecution drops. Sentencing becomes harsher. Pre-trial rights literally evaporate, and punishment extends far beyond Russia's borders, because terrorism under Russian law is extraterritorial. It follows you wherever you go. Navalny's former aide, Leonid Volkov, himself warned that this designation could act as a green light for Russian intelligence, specifically the GRU, to escalate operations targeting ACF activists abroad. When the Kremlin labels someone an extremist, the objective is domestic repression. When it labels someone a terrorist, the objective is operational freedom. That includes surveillance, threats, abductions, and in extreme cases, attacks. The state's message is simple. You are no longer opposition figures. You are prey. Just weeks earlier, Russia's financial watchdog added Vladimir Kara-Murza, Maxim Kruglov, and Ilya Yashin to its list of terrorists and extremists. Being added to the list is often described as a form of civil death, with your bank accounts frozen and livelihoods destroyed. Recent amendments expanded the criteria even further. Now, you can be labeled a terrorist without a conviction, based simply on accusations of discrediting the armed forces or hatred towards a social group. This is also about exporting fear. The Kremlin wants exiled activists to understand that distance does not equal safety. Whether you are in Vilnius, Berlin, Tbilisi, or in New York, Moscow is signaling that you remain inside its jurisdictional imagination. The Russian Supreme Court has spoken, but the verdict wasn't about the ACF. It was about the Kremlin's worldview. Dissent is terror, truth is extremism, and the war on critics is a national security priority. And the rest of the world now needs to understand what Russia has just declared, not merely a legal category, but a doctrine. And now, here to shed more light on this story is Vladimir Milov, former advisor to late Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hello, many thanks for having me on your show.
So let's begin by asking, what is Vladimir Putin afraid of? It seems like he's desperately trying to hunt down the remnants of opposition, even outside his country. This is not a sign of strength, now is it?
No, it isn't, definitely, and there are two reasons for all these recent repressive measures. First is that Kremlin administration is actually sensing that there is a very significant increase of anti-government and anti-war sentiment in Russia. It is actually being hidden behind the facade. What you hear from Russia is only propaganda, because all other voices have been shut down. But there has been a lot of signs that actually beneath the surface the negative sentiment is building up. Government is very concerned about that on the background of the so-called parliamentary elections that are coming this next year in September 2026. Yes, elections in Russia are controlled, that is true, so basically Putin does not have very much to be afraid of. But Russia had examples of organized spontaneous protest voting before, which at times it did overturn incumbent candidates, so you can expect surprises and the system might not be ready for it. So they want to shut down all the voices of dissent, making sure that these upcoming so-called elections will be show of strength, show of solidarity with Putin and his war against Ukraine. The other factor is that the opposition forces in exile are still very much relevant. No matter how much Putin wants to portray this story like, they are completely detached and don't have any influence inside the country, they actually do, because all these, repressions, designations as terrorist organizations, they go together with attempts to block like major social media outlets like WhatsApp and FaceTime, and new repressive measures against VPNs and YouTube, whatever connects Russians inside Russia with broadcasting from opposition and exile. There is a very significant audience. We're talking about millions of people. Probably the total outreach of various opposition channels abroad to people in Russia is maybe between 20 and 30 million unique users inside the country. That's a worrisome trend for Putin, that opposition from abroad still has relevance and influence on public opinion. So really they are afraid of potential unpleasant surprises.
So now, of course, critics often say, well, why aren't these protests visible? They often point towards countries like Iran, where protests did spill out onto the streets and caused significant unrest before being suppressed by the authorities, quite brutally, in fact. Whereas in Russia, they say there is very little of that. What would you say is the reason? Could it be because Vladimir Putin was so effective at destroying the entire structure, the entire, so to say, underlying inner workings of civic society, that it's just, individuals might be dissatisfied with the government, but they are finding it very difficult to connect to one another, to create this momentum for dissent. How do you actually counter this at this stage, when, as you said, even means of communication are being suppressed? I mean, Putin's government has even blocked Roblox. It's a video game, but they said it could be used for extremist purposes. This is how far it goes.
This is very much true what you are saying. As a matter of fact, we did have a major nationwide protest movement between 2017 and 2021. We had regular nationwide protest rallies in dozens of major cities, bringing together hundreds of thousands of people. That was pretty impressive. After which, roughly a year before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Putin began to jail opposition leaders, starting from Alexei Navalny, and he began designating opposition organizations as extremists. So it's very difficult to assemble people when you don't have organized opposition structures on the ground. When there's nobody to call people to the streets in an organized manner. So what I hear, for instance, as a feedback from my pretty massive Russian audience is that people are saying, we actually are ready to go and protest, but we don't want to do it alone, because we will be jailed and get a real prison term, and that is it. We would take part in some real massive movement, but we need to be sure that people would come. For that, you need organized structures operating on the ground, and this is actually what Putin is aiming at. Also with his recent designations of opposition forces as terrorist, extremist, and so on, his message is like, stay away from any organized activity on the ground. This is effectively criminalized, and you can get lengthy prison terms for that. What will take to overcome this situation is the general weakening of the regime. We have massive historical experience how it happened in Russia. Previously, the very impressive story was in late 80s, where the overall incapacitation of the ruling communist regime, its inability to cope with multiple and mounting problems in social, economic sphere, the war in Afghanistan, what have you, they actually discredited the authority of the ruling government. So people, gradually they started to take on it, and finally mass numbers of people turned out to the streets. I think we will witness similar process for years ahead, but we're not there yet. But the early signs clearly are appearing. This is actually why Putin is nervous, and this is why all the recent crackdown that you have mentioned.
But aren't you concerned that, well, as you said, back in the 80s, you had the West rooting for these opposition forces, being much more supportive. You had a very cohesive narrative about, the Soviet Union, the Soviet government being the evil empire, and the West confronting it. Right now it's different. You have the United States maintaining a more ambiguous stance. You have the European Union unable to unite on issues such as financing Ukraine. Like you had Belgium recently saying we're not going to take the the frozen Russian government assets. And on the other hand, you have Putin actually extending the influence into various political forces across Europe and beyond. Aren't you concerned that even if the momentum within the Russian opposition is there, the Russian opposition might be left alone, might not actually have this additional support from the West, and that could make a massive difference there?
No, actually the situation is a bit different. It was much worse in the 80s, because in the 80s Russians were living in a total information blockade with complete lack of democratic experience. And what we heard about the West was largely TV reporting about President Reagan posturing Pershing 2 missiles in Germany targeted at Russia. This is what we knew about the West. Only gradually, with Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost, we started to learn, and also listening to Western radio stations broadcasting from abroad, we're starting to learn that the West is actually not the enemy. It took time for Russian people to realize the complexity of the world that is not as Soviet propaganda depicting. Again, it was developing gradually. Initially, in the first anti-communist protests that we saw in like 87, they were relatively small. They were growing in size over time, and what you remember probably are the latest moment of that. Right now, the situation is very different. We have a significant part of the Russian population, significant part. About a third of the population and people who are mostly living in big cities who actually never accepted this system such as it is. They voted against Putin and his party at the elections until the very last moment when it was possible. They turned out at massive Navalny rallies just 5 years ago when it was still allowed. These people remember freedom. They basically never let it go, and they express, a lot of them cannot speak out being afraid of being jailed, but they express in communication with us solidarity with Ukraine, solidarity with Europe. So there is a very significant part of Russia which remembers and is still committed to European values. That is, I would argue, still, the most relevant part of the society as far as forward progress of Russia is concerned. You will see it will be back on stage politically. For that, we need for the government authority to crumble and repression to recede for these people to come out. This will happen pretty much as it did in the 80s. However, again, at this point, the ultimate objective should be weakening the Putin regime through pressure, through supporting Ukraine, through sanctions, through all possible means, so that the government loses authority, loses ability to govern. That will also unleash the protest forces that are currently being contained within the Russian society.
So it's also a question of the political will and strategy in the West to be prepared and be able to bring about this decline of Putin's regime in Russia. Vladimir Milov was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight and experience.
Thanks for having me.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. Russia is continuing its crackdown on social media platforms. The country's state communications regulator has now restricted or blocked several new platforms.
Russian authorities seem eager to fulfill their dream of an internet space dominated solely by Russian-controlled social media. Roskomnadzor has confirmed that it has blocked the social media app Snapchat and imposed severe restrictions on Apple's video and voice calling service FaceTime. The reason given for these restrictions is that, according to Russian authorities, they were being used to, quote, organize and carry out terrorist activities. These are not the first social media platforms to be banned or restricted in Russia this year. Russian authorities had previously restricted the use of WhatsApp and Telegram, leaving FaceTime as the only unrestricted, commonly accessible platform. At the same time, Russia is pushing for the use of its domestically made social media apps, over which the government has far more control.
Russia is escalating its rhetoric towards certain NATO members and Eastern European countries. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has accused the Baltic states and Moldova of passing, and I quote, racist laws against the Russian minorities.
Russia's recent rhetoric directed at NATO Eastern Flank members and Moldova is eerily reminiscent of the words Russian officials used in relation to Ukraine prior to the invasion of February 2022. The narrative about discrimination against Russian-speaking minorities is almost exactly the same one that the Kremlin used to justify its aggression against Ukraine. Observers warn that this is something that could be described as a Phase Zero tactic, which involves the wide-scale use of propaganda and disinformation to prepare for potential military maneuvers or other forms of destabilization. Moldova in particular witnessed very heavy Russian interference during its recent election season. There have been concerns about a potential Russian military operation against the country, as it is not a NATO member unlike the Baltic states.
Georgian state universities will no longer accept foreign students starting the next academic year. Private universities will still be allowed to admit international students, though.
The Georgian Ministry of Education has raised concerns about the need to prioritize Georgian students, as the share of foreign students at some state universities is as high as around 45%. The number of foreign students in Georgia more than doubled between 2021 and 2025, from some 17,500 to over 37,000. Some observers are warning that this is yet another step by the ruling Georgian Dream Party to isolate the country from the international academic community. Others are worried that the lack of foreign students will lead to a massive drop in the competitiveness of Georgian state universities. What's more, students in the country's academic circles have been some of the most vocal opponents of the Georgian Dream's policies over the last year, and thousands of students have taken part in the anti-government protests that shook the country.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.